welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at India and Pakistan today, with a little bit more focus on India, but the two are so related that they really go hand in hand with a lot of these different metrics. So if you take a look at India and Pakistan today, one of the first things in step one we're going to be looking at is a few different metrics of how well a country is doing today. And I found this good kind of wrap up of the Indian economy within the fiscal year of 2019-2020. Fiscal deficit, you don't want this to be a large percentage of your GDP. They're lowering that over time, which is a good thing. Inflation is you do not want a lot of inflation in your country. You generally want it to be a pretty stable line. So that's gone down for the most part in their country. Services have gone down. You want a faster growth rate for services. Generally speaking, whenever a country goes through like a demographic transition, whenever they're really transitioning to a service sector, you usually see that going up. Theirs is going down. Industrial growth, how much stuff is being made. That went up sharply in 1819 and went down dramatically in 1920. Agricultural, making food and all that, allied sectors, current account balance, foreign exchange reserves. So the Indian economy is a bit of a mixed bag right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we can directly say that uncertainty comes from their illustrious history, right? And that's really what we want to take a deep dive into, trying to find out where these metrics really all point to in terms of the grand scheme of India and Pakistan. The second thing that we're not going to be able to have the time to touch on completely is the literacy rate in India, how and access to education, especially for women in India, and people in rural communities, has been quite underwhelming for the past 100 years or so. So if we look at this has the literacy rate on the y-axis. On the x-axis, it has the years. Male is in red, so we see that red line. They have a higher percentage. Female is that blue line. The total, if you combine them, is this line in the middle. The urban would be like city areas, that would be this dotted line up here, and then rural would be this blue dotted line here. So we can take away a few different things from this map. So in general, literacy has gotten better over the past 100 years or so. It's the incline of it to go upwards. We also see there's disparities between men and women with access to education. There's hundreds of millions of women who do not have access to education within India, a country with a huge population. We see a difference between urban and rural, so you're more likely to be able to get an education in city areas as opposed to kind of the rural areas, the countryside. And so where it all comes back to is really the legacy of British colonialism within India. They help to explain a lot of these different problems. So for step 2, we're going to watch this video, and I want you to identify and submit 5 ways British colonialism still affects India today.
Film about the partition of India has reopened questions surrounding Britain's colonial legacy. Viceroy's House, starring Hugh Bonneville and Gillian Anderson, tells the story of Lord Mountbatten arriving in India in 1947. Here's a clip.
300 million Hindus and Sikhs want a united India. 100 million Muslims do not. You dance with your own kind.
My own kind.
Have some respect.
New nations are rarely born in peace.
It's got to be a clean cut. It's a bloody axe cleaving right through people's lives.
We're joined by Shashi Tharoor, author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi, a very warm welcome to you. Do you think most British people have a grasp of what partition involved?
I'm afraid they don't. My book is, of course, about the entire 200 years of colonial rule, when Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world and reduced it over 200 years of plunder into one of the poorest. Partition was merely the sort of shambolic conclusion to that episode, that entire experience, the sort of tragic original Brexit, as it were, that took place in conditions that made 15 million people lose their homes and their lives, and 1 million.
So that's one effect, right? 15 million people losing their homes. That dramatically changes the landscape of an entire people or an entire country.
And lose their lives. So I think Britain certainly should know a little more about the things that it was quite directly responsible for in the subcontinent.
Before we talked, I was looking at a review by Max Hastings, journalist of some repute, military historian of some repute, former editor of Daily Telegraph and other periodicals, newspapers, who was reviewing Neil Ferguson's book, which gives a flip side, an alternative view of the colonial experience. He opens with these words. This is Max Hastings. Most modern British school children are taught that imperialism was an unalloyed evil. That was in 2003. You don't share that view?
Well, no, because I actually know people who've done A-levels in history and have never learned a line of colonial history.
That's a little bit of read between the lines, right? But what he's really saying is that maybe similar to American history, we're not completely certain of the entire depth of these colonial pasts, right? How many people were affected. The things that we read in educational textbooks today might not be completely reflective about what historians know to be true about the colonial history of countries like Britain.
Is not, in fact, something that British school children are taught. Perhaps Mr. Hastings was speaking of a different era, but certainly not in recent years has history about what the British did in their far-flung colonial possessions actually been taught to British school children.
Well, you say far-flung possessions, but I mean, yes, famines killed hordes of people in India, but so too in Ireland as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, British policies on famines, which killed 35 million Indians in totally unnecessary man-made disasters because of British policy, were exactly the policies they pursued in Ireland that led to so many deaths in the Great Potato Blight and led Irish people to flee to America. Indians, of course, didn't have that option.
If not the UK, I mean, you talk about the way the British impoverished India over a period of 200 years. Was it not just one of those periods in history when part of the world enjoyed a technological advantage over others? And, nature abhors a vacuum. If the British hadn't poured into the vacuum, then the Russians would have done. That's what the Great Game, as it used to be called, was all about, how the British would block the Russians from getting into India and seizing it. And there is a view, isn't there? You may disagree with it. There is a view that says when it comes to that collection of European powers who were imperially minded, the British were the least worst option. I mean, compared, for instance, to, well, I mentioned the Russians, but oftentimes comparisons are made with the Belgians.
This is like saying you prefer being flogged with a whip to being flogged with a cane. I'm sorry, I'd much rather not have been colonized by anybody.
But you didn't have an option, Shashi, that's the point.
No,
that
the
such
point
was the
is, when you
technological
talk
imbalance
for example,
at that time that the
you
Russians
talk
would have
about
done it if we did.
Technological imbalance. Do you think the richest country in the world couldn't have bought the technology it wanted if it hadn't been subjugated by a foreign power that destroyed the industries it actually had and prevented it from creating its own industries? We missed the boat.
A huge thing that's mentioned here is that this is whenever a lot of countries are really beginning to industrialize and take advantage of the technological advances that are going on in the late 1700s, the early 1800s. Because India missed that period of time, they got stopped, like they got delayed in these demographic transitions to be able to build these businesses up that were so key in getting profit for a lot of the countries. They were doing so well before ultimately being colonized by Britain.
Bus for the Industrial Revolution, true, but we missed the bus because the British Empire threw us under its wheels. It's as simple as that. We were the world's leading textile producers, the world's leading textile exporters, the world's leading shipbuilding country, the world's leading steel manufacturers. All of these industries were destroyed by the British quite deliberately. And a captive market was created by the British in India to unload their goods on this country.
When you paint that picture of what the India that might have been in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, people look at modern day India and say, well, in a sense, normal service has been resumed. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is where we had to start from in 1947. The British left us with 90% of the population living below the poverty line.
Did they leave anything good behind?
Beg your pardon?
Did they leave anything good behind?
In 1947, around the time of partition between India and Pakistan, 90% of the population of India living under the poverty line. The consequences for that speak for themselves.
Well, they left a number of things that were not intended to be for the benefit of Indians, but which, once they were left behind, were transformed by the Indians into benefiting them. Such as, for example, the railways, which have been created in order to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take them to the ports to be shipped to England for the greater glory of England. But of course, once the British left, we were able to use the railways and continue to do so for the benefit of Indians, and particularly for passenger movement, not for extracting resources. Similarly, with many other British legacies, none of which were actually introduced to India to benefit the Indians, but only to serve as instruments of either British control or British profit.
But the point about the British control that you mentioned, it had to work with those who were complicit at the other end. So who's worthy of the greatest blame?
They go into a bunch of different topics after that. You can continue watching this if you want, but he's made his message super clear about really the plunder of India, extracting those resources and all the consequences that come from British colonialism up to that point. So be sure you submit 5 ways that British colonialism still affects India today. And then finally, for step 3, you're going to go to Google News, select a current events article which tells us more about the politics, social situations, economics, or international relations of India or Pakistan, and then submit the following: the name of the article, a 2 to 4 sentence summary of your article, how your article relates to the politics, social situations, economics, or international relations, and then how your article enhances our understanding of modern India or Pakistan. And then what you ultimately submit is your responses to steps 2 and 3. Have a wonderful day.